Hi, thank you very much for joining me. Today we are in the book of Judges. The book of Judges is one of those books that you might call a transitional book. After the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, you have the book of Joshua, and Joshua records for us the great opportunity for God to bring his people into the promised land. When you transition into Judges, they're going to go from the continuation, which should have been the complete removal of the enemies of the nation of Israel from the promised land. Unfortunately, they fail to do that. But the first couple of chapters give us some great wonderful victories. There are people like Caleb who are massive in following the Lord. They have great fear of the Lord. They're fearless warriors. I don't care if they're 80 years old. They are charging on and they want the land held by the giants. Even their own kids are asking for wonderful blessings, even though the land where they're going to take is going to be filled with problems and difficulties and maybe even giants. And then you find that right on the heels of that comes the great victories, the great blessing, and an opportunity for even those who are giants to run and flee from them. But yet their brothers, their cousins of Israel, they settle in, they get either complacent or they've had enough and they stop. And all it takes if you want to move backward is just not continue to move forward. So they stop taking forward ground. As they stop taking forward ground, we find that then 2 things happen. You'll see this phrase used at least 4 times in the book of Judges. In that time, there was no king in Israel. Now, there wasn't the necessity for a king. They were promised in Genesis 49 that one day they would have a king. The scepter would not depart from Judah. But up until God giving them or prescribing for them a king, they had a leader, and the leader was Joshua. They had a leader. The leader was Moses. Now God wants to raise up leaders, but he's growing them into a nation where they are supposed to be so mature that they can do what is right in God's eyes. But because they fail to have a king, each man does what is right in their own eyes. That's almost a definition of anarchy. So the book changes from the victories to the complacency, and it doesn't take long. It's about 1 generation. Now, a generation in their day could be as much as 25 to 40 years. During that period of time, the ones that were the battle-hardened veterans, they have ceased their battles, and the next generation, their children, they're not fighters. And they choose not to fight, and they say, do we really have to? Isn't it okay if? And they find themselves living the life that the Canaanites have lived. And when they live the life that the Canaanites have lived, what they find is they fall into their ways, and their ways lead them into some type of oppression or bondage. Pretty soon, their neighbors that they thought were their friends are now their oppressors, and they cry out to God. When they cry out to God, God sends a deliverer, a person that he calls a judge. Notice I didn't say a man he calls a judge, because there's one judge named Deborah who's a woman. But the first judge is named Othniel, and Othniel leads the nation of Israel. It's a victory. However, it's bloody. The book of Judges is not for the faint of heart. We need to recognize the lessons that are learned in there. Anytime we fall backward, we start heading in a decline, allow sin, justify it, continue to call evil good, it gets very difficult, heavily oppressed, and even if you do gain ground, it seems like you never gain fully back what you lost, and it's more difficult than it is just to recover what it is that your parents had or your grandparents had, and you never even seem to measure up. So in the days in which we live, we kind of compare them to the days of the revival. Well, we're not living up to the days of the revival. So we compare it to something lesser. We compare it to those who were, I'll use the Mayberry phrase, and that's the ones that you didn't have to lock your doors at night, and you left you could even leave your car keys in the visor of your car, believe it or not, nobody would steal it. Those were the days, but now we're not living in those days. And if we were to gain back ground, maybe we could reach a place where we might feel safer in our homes. But I don't know if we're going back to a place where you can leave your doors unlocked. So what does that mean? It means that when we cry out, nation of Israel cried out, God sent the deliverer. When he sends the deliverer then says, we're going to do God's purpose, God's way. which means we're going to have to make some changes in our life. Get rid of the idols, take down the places of worship, and we're going to have to do business with God so we can do business with the enemy. When that happens, God brings victory. And you find the wonderful Othniel, you find a Jephthah or Jehu right after him, and then the third judge is Deborah. Deborah's in a time when there's a man named Barak who is a military leader, but he's even afraid to go, and he won't go unless Deborah goes with him. But God calls Deborah to be a judge. God allows for that. Read these events for yourself. They're amazing. And God gives the victory to a woman. Jael is going to be a stalwart in this scene. She's going to be a heroine here. And the nation of Israel, you think that they would get it, but each generation then fails to remember the victories or the cost for their settling into sin. As a result, they fall into sin eventually. They feel oppressed. They cry out to God. When God delivers them, he sends a judge. You then find a couple of more judges. You're going to find a man named Gideon. Gideon, who is a man who finds himself hiding. God calls him a mighty man of valor and then demonstrates to the whole land. He said, you can have great victory and I'll give it to you. Gideon then defeats some tens of thousands, I think it's 40,000 people, the Midianite army, and he defeats them with 300 men armed with a pitcher and a torch. And they break the pitcher, exposing the torch, and say the battle belongs to the Lord, and God gives them great victory. You would think that they would learn that lesson, that they would remember that, but they become just as complacent, go back to their old ways. Gideon himself falls into idol worship. Gideon himself becomes a violent man, and bad things happen. When the last of the judges, second to last of the judges actually, comes out, his name is Samson. Samson is arguably the worst of the judges, but God uses him to still deliver his people. Samson, the story should be familiar. It is a man who rejected even the calling of God, squandered every blessing that God gave him. But over and over again, God said, I'm going to come upon this one, and I'm going to allow them to have victory and lead well. Samson squandered that great privilege until it cost him all but his life. It cost him his eyes and it cost him his freedom. And then he cried out to God, and God delivered in a great and mighty way, but it cost him his life at that point. The end of the book, the close of the book, ends with a couple of things. One is the complete deterioration of the nation of Israel. You start to see them fall into such decay that priests aren't doing the right thing. People are hiring priests. Priests are doing bad things. And then there are some terrible, you have to read this for yourself. There are some terrible things happening to people. It's bloody, it's vicious, and there are some terrible events that eventually lead them into their first civil war. And the enemy laughs in derision. But God's not finished with the nation of Israel. The lessons we learn are that when we cry out to God, God hears our prayer and he answers. And if my people called by my name will humble themselves and pray and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and heal their land. That's God's promise. And when they do, he fulfills his promise. When they reject him, he will allow them to have and bear the fruits of their rejection, and they'll live like the Canaanites and they'll be judged like the Canaanites, and it's very painful to watch that. Second takeaway is this, that God does not judge the children for the sin of their parents. When the parents sin and fall into iniquity, and that generation, whomever they are, cry out to God, he never turns his back on them and says, you're going to have to suffer because of your parents. Right on the heels of that, also recognize that when they, as parents, demonstrate to their children that God is not the one to be followed or worshiped and obeyed, then they fall into decline and decay, and it makes it more difficult for their children, who find that they have to come to a place where they're virtually hopeless before they cry out to God, and then God answers them and has to answer them directly. So how about we skip that step and we demonstrate to the people around us that we trust in the true and living God, and we want to walk and live in the victory. When the book ends, it ends with a transition into, because you'll see the phrase 4 times, there was no king in Israel, and God is going to set up the opportunity using the last of the judges, whose name is Samuel. And in the book of Ruth, we're going to find after the book of Judges comes the book of Ruth, and that's going to be the lineage and the heritage of the greatest king of Israel, King David. And then you'll see the last judge, and that's Samuel. And Samuel is going to transition into the time of the kings. So God bless you. Continue reading his word. God writes good stuff.